No, mit Irena haben wir gedavnt Minche, ist schon jetzt die Zeit zu davnen Ma'ariv. Ich bin sehr zufrieden, was ist da voran, Kina Horash, ein schöner Minion. Und weiter auf Englisch. Like all families, the Jewish family has a history. Or better, many, almost an infinite number of histories, and I'll only be able to point to a few of them this evening. Moreover, those histories are gendered. The new focus on histories of gender is part of a broader new emphasis on histories of private and everyday life. As Jewish historian Paula Hyman pointed out, especially given the withdrawal of distinctively Jewish behavior into the private sphere as part of assimilation to modern liberal societies, this interest in gender means that the historian must enter the Jewish home. Indeed, Hyman suggests that one aspect of this domestication of Jewishness was an increasing emphasis on women's role in enacting and transmitting Jewish identity at the expense of men's public ritual roles. But Jewish domestic dramas are hardly confined to our own time. We can go back to the beginning, to the family narratives of Genesis. These family narratives describe the limits set by founders of lineages on whom their sons might marry, as when Abraham tells his servant to make sure that Isaac does not marry a local Canaanite, but rather someone from my country and my kindred. One powerful theme that comes through in the Bible narrative is the idea of the nativity of a people. The people whose story it tells are the children of Israel. The name indicates those descended from the one who was born Jacob, but was given the new name Israel to mark his new relationship with God, independent, at least to a degree, from the relationship between God and Jacob's grandfather, Abraham. The narrative of this name change and of the name's bearer becoming the founder of a new lineage follows Jacob's departure from his father-in-law Laban's home with his wives, concubines, and children. On the near side of the river Yabok, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the end of the day. And the man saw that he could not overcome Jacob, and he said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." And Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with man, and have won." Thus, Jacob's descendants are the children of Israel. But the nation is also often simply called Israel. Similarly, the 12 tribes that in the biblical narrative made up the nation are commonly referred to by the names of their founders, themselves the 12 sons of Jacob or Israel. The pattern repeats itself in succeeding generations, descendants of whom are all known by the name of their common male ancestor. Literary scholar Ilana Pardes focuses on this question of nativity in her article Imagining the Birth of Ancient Israel. Her title reminds us that we still tend to think of nations as being born, and hence of nations as being like individual human beings, and belonging similarly to families of nations. Her theme is that perhaps more than any other national history, the Bible is explicitly a family story. Perhaps this suggests another reason why the Jewish family might seem to be unique among types of human families. As Pardes reminds us, the book of Genesis contains at least 2 origin stories. One gives us the origins of culture as such, that is, the origin of all human culture. The other tells us about the origins of the children of Israel. The latter moment is itself double, marked first by the departure of Abraham from the land of his birth, and second by the exodus from Egypt. Pardes concentrates on the exodus, which inspires further family metaphors in Scripture. In the exodus, the subsequent wanderings, and the eventual entry into the land of Israel, the new nation's relation to God is that of a wayward son to a troubled father. The nation, she writes, is both the chosen son and the rebel son, and accordingly, its relationship with the father is at once intimate and strained. The departure from Egypt with signs and wonders and God's outstretched hand marks the true birth of the nation, even though the family may trace its lineage further back to the times of the patriarchs. The nation of Israel is not autochthonous, that is, it is not understood to be born on the land in which it dwells, and that helps define it. Israel's dependence on its divine Father is thereby emphasized all the more. Nor is Israel cast only as a son. In a remarkable passage in the book of Ezekiel, the new nation is described both as an abandoned infant female and eventually as God's lover or bride. Once in the desert, the children of Israel complain like children. Moreover, their expressions of longing for Egypt and their desire to return are rather like a desire to return to the womb. For this collective newborn, Egypt is not only a place of suffering and privation, but a remembered place of fetal nurturance. The motifs and metaphors of birth are many, as are those of being lost and finding the way home. The people, of course, proliferate while still in Egypt, and that is what frightens Pharaoh into the terrible decree against the firstborn males. Behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. Moses returned to his true parentage after having been raised as part of the royal Egyptian family and then fleeing Egypt as a fugitive. This exemplifies a paradigmatic Jewish narrative of wandering, near dissolution, and return. Pardes suggests that the blood the Israelites are told to place on their doorposts the night before their departure is itself the blood of a new birth. Similarly, the parting of the Red Sea is a narrow passage through walls of water. God, then, is divine midwife, as well as father, lover, husband. The biblical family saga is by no means all triumphal. Far from summarizing a triumphant hero's biography, Pardes wants to stress throughout that this is a narrative in which conflicting views of the nation are placed side by side, where exhilarating moments of collective creativity are juxtaposed with moments of immense despair and appalling violence. How different is that from any honestly told family story? Now, Ilana Pardes' interpretation seems to presume that there really is something that can confidently be pointed to as the Jewish nation. Can there be Jewish families if there is no Jewish nation? Let's hold that question for now. There's no doubt that Jewish populations in the diaspora have long constituted distinctive and fairly stable groupings, defined by such things as language, practice, place of residence, or place of origin. So it is important to acknowledge that families may work differently in those different groups of Jews, and that non-Ashkenazi Jews, including Sephardim and those now called Mizrahim, may be distinctive in ways that throw into further question any unified notion of the Jewish family. For example, it's certainly true that Jews in North Africa practiced endogamy among themselves, meaning that they did their best to make sure their children married other Jews. Yet that doesn't mean any Jewish family in North Africa might intermarry with any other. On the contrary, anthropologist Harvey Goldberg suggests that distinctive forms of family life and gender did much to preserve the social hierarchy separating the native Tunisian Jews from the Sephardi Jews who came by way of Livorno, as we heard this afternoon. On the other hand, Goldberg rather surprisingly, but entirely plausibly, argues that at least in the rural hinterlands of Morocco, Jews could be family members of powerful Muslims, all while maintaining the rules against intermarriage. This was so because Moroccan views of family ties included friendship and patronage. Thus, Goldberg argues, if the Moroccan Muslim family can include clients and other non-kin, then it can also include Jews who are under its protection and who carry its name, at least from the point of view of the Muslims. He concludes the discussion by suggesting that the possibility of such strong loyalties between Jews and Muslim patrons may be tied to the relative weakness of organized Jewish communities in North Africa. In other words, in places like Ashkenaz, anything like family relations between Jews and non-Jews was unthinkable, and Jewish families consistently served to reinforce the bounds of Jewish community. Yet where Jews had other options for family-like forms of loyalty, they might not have relied on each other in such a powerfully regulated and communal fashion. Now, I've made a quick leap from biblical Israel to the contemporary Maghreb, partly to help demonstrate that Jewish family patterns vary according to geography and culture, as well as changing through time. It's worth underscoring this point, since any overview in Jewish studies runs some risk of leaving the impression that Jews in different times and places are somehow identical with one another. Another risk comes from the well-established pattern of drawing analogies between genealogy and history, between family narratives and the narratives of nations. It's a comfortable pattern, but one that scholars should be wary of. History is like genealogy, but not the same thing. Nations are like families, but not really just families on a grander scale. For these reasons, approaching the question of the Jewish family is not a matter of simple chronology, as if the task were as simple as listing who begat whom in the old-fashioned language of the English Bibles. In a sense, it's illusory even to pretend that it's possible, as I did, to go back to the beginning with the Bible and start there. In fact, there are many possible starting places. One such starting place, and perhaps the safest, is the here and now, the place where we find ourselves. If that place happens to be contemporary Germany, as it almost is tonight, a historian is likely to be led quickly to wonder about the hostilities between Christians and Jews in medieval German lands, and what relation those might have had to the disasters of the 20th century. That is exactly how the Israeli historian Israel Jacob Yuval begins his provocative book, Two Nations in Your Womb: Perceptions of Christians and Jews in Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Yuval's most controversial claim pertains to the blood libel, the Christian legends and actual charges that Jews murdered Christian children for their blood. He argues that the blood libel was inspired by the historical reality of Jewish parents killing their children in the face of Crusader raids, rather than allowing the children to be forcibly converted. Yuval describes standing at a spot in Germany where the Jews gathered in 1096, readying themselves for such martyrdom. He writes, this was a rare occasion, one in which my profession as historian and my duty as father coincided. The question that the father within posed to the historian within was a pointed one. What can motivate sane people to kill their own children, to hurl them to such a cruel death? Yuval's answer to this tormented question leads him and us to a key biblical passage used for almost 2 millennia by Jews as by Christians to ground their competing claims to be the proper heirs to the coming messianic kingdom. This theme is that of God's announcement to Rebekah, pregnant with quarrelsome twins. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Mother Rebekah must have known that trouble was coming, for in her world of biblical narrative, as in nearly every human time and place, the principle of primogeniture applied to grant presumptive rights to the firstborn son. That son was Esau, but with Rebekah's connivance, his rights as firstborn eventually fell to his brother Jacob. But the story of Jacob and Esau is hardly the only biblical narrative where the established order concerning relations